how did moral centres of gravity affect the conduct and the result of the Vietnam War? I discussed this question with Sir Max Hastings, the author of Vietnam, An Epic Tragedy, 1945 to 1975.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 61 of the Principles of War podcast. Today, I'm really honoured to present to you my interview with Sir Max Hastings. Sir Max, I think, is one of the most talented historians of warfare in the 20th century. Today, we discuss his book, Vietnam, An Epic Tragedy, 1945 to 1975. I first read this book about 2 years ago, and it is unequalled in its time frame, its breadth, and the depth with which it goes to give you an understanding of the Vietnam War. Sir Max worked in Vietnam as a journalist, and he has built on that with an enormous amount of research, interviewing hundreds of people, to be able to tell the story of the Vietnam War in incredible detail. After I read his book, I then felt compelled to read Neil Sheehan's A Bright and Shining Lie, David Hackworth's About Face, and H.R. McMaster's Dereliction of Duty. The real strength of this book, I think, is Sir Max's ability to clearly articulate the issues at the strategic level and then highlight how that impacted the tactical conduct of the battle, the impact that it had on individuals' lives. The enduring theme of the book, from my point of view, is the moral centres of gravity and how each stakeholder in this complex system protected or didn't their moral centre of gravity, and how they fought to undermine or didn't the centre of gravity of their enemy. So let's get into it, my interview with Sir Max Hastings. Good evening, Sir Max. Welcome to the podcast.
Good evening, James. Very nice to be talking to you.
So your book, Vietnam, An Epic Tragedy, do you want to just let us know a little bit about what it's about?
I was a very young correspondent in Vietnam in the early 1970s, but I never thought I was going to write a book about it because I've written a lot of books on the First and Second World Wars and so on, but Vietnam was such a squalid, miserable story that it was only in the last few years that I suddenly started to think. I've read a lot of books about the American military. I've read quite a few books by the communists. I've read quite a few books by correspondents who went there, but I never read a single book that tried to bring the whole story together, to tell it from the northern and the southern viewpoint, from the American viewpoint, and so on. When I started researching North Vietnamese sources, and I was very lucky, I became close to a former wonderful man, former CIA agent in Vietnam named Merle Pribenhout. And Merle, ever since he came out of Saigon about the same time as I did in the evacuation in 1975, he's been translating North Vietnamese sources, memoirs, diaries, official documents. He had this great treasure trove of stuff that nobody had used before. And so this gave me a whole new dimension on the story that to me was very important. For example, what I was able to do, and this is the miracle of instantaneous communication, that I'd be writing about a given battle from the American perspective, and I had all the American documents in front of me, and I'd interviewed Americans who take part in the battle and so on. Then I'd just send an email to Merle, and I'd say, what about this action on September the 13th, 1968? What can you tell me about it from the North Vietnamese? And I don't know whether he ever slept, because within 24 hours, he'd come back to me with a whole raft of stuff on the North Vietnamese perspective on this and so on. So all the way through, one was trying to look at this from both sides' point of view. And although there are many wonderful books by Americans, an awful lot of them are just about how it looked if you were a grunt, as they used to call the GIs, from a sort of a bamboo's eye view out there in the boonies and so on. So anyway, I brought it all together, and I felt in the end that one had done something that I hope was quite new.
From my perspective, it was. I've read quite a few books about Vietnam. Obviously, Australia had a significant involvement there, starting a long time before the Americans would say that the Vietnam War started, and looking quite a bit further on after the end of the war as well, but also the impact on the government, the civil population. Not many books tend to look at it from that point of view, which is why I think it's such a useful book. Starting with the American involvement in Vietnam, APBAC was one of their first key battles in 1963, and it highlighted some of the issues that would undermine the US efforts in South Vietnam. Why were the lessons from APBAC continually ignored by the US military, do you think?
The US military in 1963, and indeed right through the 60s, were brilliantly configured to fight the Russian army in Europe, if need be. But they were not brilliantly configured for counterinsurgency. And the first weakness, which APBAC revealed, which remained true all the way through the war, was the weakness of US intelligence. For all the billions that they spent on intelligence, they knew next to nothing about the other side all the way through. And this was true at a tactical level. At APBAC, John Paul Vann, the American colonel who was chief advisor, who orchestrated the battle at APBAC, he thought that there was a small force of Viet Cong in this village, which he was going to orchestrate a very elaborate combined all-arms operation to take these people out. And the first piece of intelligence he got completely wrong was that there were far more Viet Cong in this village, in this area, than he knew about. They were pretty well armed. They were very highly motivated. He was working with American helicopters, but with South Vietnamese troops. So he gives the orders on this one fine morning for this great, very complicated pincer movement to begin on this hamlet. Of course, not only are the pincers not closed, but one half of the pincers never got going. That a load of local militia who were supposed to sort of spearhead the first attack, as soon as they came under fire from the Viet Cong, they just stopped where they were and didn't do much for the rest of the day. Then Vann orders armored personnel carriers to move into the area after a couple of, to pick up survivors after 3 American helicopters had been shot down by the North Vietnamese. Nothing happens. That the APCs don't move. Why not? Because their commander refuses to move. He said it's too dangerous. He said it's too difficult to get across the water. Then they stage a parachute jump. The paratroops are landed in the wrong place, and they land almost on top of the Viet Cong, and they're shot to pieces. At the end of this calamitous day, Vann is flying up and down the battlefield at low level in a spotter plane, and he's apparently going mad because he's a very motivated, intense guy. And he's shouting down the radio at these people, get on with it, get these APCs moving, get these guys moving, and so on and so forth. And none of it's happening because the South Vietnamese, the Americans, come in, especially Vann, an ambitious, very driven, highly motivated career soldier. He wants to get on with fighting the war. The poor bastards, the South Vietnamese, have already been fighting the war for years. They don't have a 6-month or a 1-year or even a 2-year stint in Vietnam. They're stuck with being in the army, fighting this thing, month after month and year after year. They are not motivated to get out there and kill, frankly, to die, in the way that a career soldier like John Paul Vann is. And all the way through, the Americans find this problem, that they're trying to wind up the South Vietnamese army to do stuff that the South Vietnamese army, most of it, there are some good units, but most of it just doesn't want to do. And all the way through, and here I would argue there's a very important message for other interventions. The fundamental problem is that from beginning to end, in all the big meetings in Washington to discuss what was to be done about Vietnam and the communist threat, no Vietnamese were present at those meetings. All the meetings, whether of U.S. military, whether of presidents, whether of White House advisors, these are all Americans discussing this. And all the time, they're not discussing what is in the best interests of the Vietnamese people, other than, yes, a sort of vague concept of freedom as against communist tyranny. They're asking, what have we got to do for reasons of American domestic and foreign policy? And to me, one of the most telling moments in this whole thing was when JFK, President Kennedy, who's often said if he'd lived, he'd have got America out of Vietnam. I don't believe it, because he told one friend and one close advisor, J.K. Galbraith, he said to Galbraith in 62, he said he was very conscious of his re-election campaign coming up in 64. He said, there's only just so many concessions to the communists I can make in any 1 year and ask the American people to re-elect me. So all the way down the track, and this goes on with Johnson, this goes on, they're all asking themselves, what is going to work for the United States? What is going to work for United States foreign policy? And these wretched Vietnamese, you then go back to the coal face and the battle at Outback. And again, this is an American officer telling the South Vietnamese troops how to fight a battle, which is really being orchestrated to fit objectives that have been drawn up by American officers in Saigon. And if I was asked in one sentence why the communists won the war, my answer is always the same. I say, because they were Vietnamese and the Americans were not Vietnamese.
It's a small point that I think seems to be missed by a lot of people who, particularly when it comes to counterinsurgency and some of our later forays after Vietnam. So some of the ARVN units fought very bravely and some of them didn't, and there appeared to be widespread corruption in the officer ranks. What was the cause of this, and how much of an impact do you think it had on the morale and fighting power of the ARVN units?
Corruption had an enormous effect. That the army, for a start, was incredibly badly paid. And I remember when I was there, I remember once visiting a Sky Raider squadron of the South Vietnamese Air Force, and they had this enormous fish pond. And I was sort of surprised by this, and I say, you've got these because they're pretty to look at. And he said, no, this is what we eat. And he said, if you think we could, this is a South Vietnamese pilot talking, he says, we couldn't possibly live off of what we're paid. He said, we have to have a fish pond, and we have to have our own chickens, and we have to have our own estancia anyway that we can feed our families. And of course, it was far worse at the bottom. That a lot of commanding officers were corrupt and stole the money they were given to pay their troops. They stole the rice that they were given to feed their troops. And yes, it had an enormous effect. And you still see the same forces in play in Afghanistan. When I visited Afghanistan occasionally with our chiefs of staff, and it's still the same problem that very few of our guys speak the language, and their people, I mean, the Afghan army, I mean, it's some of them are quite good fighting troops, but they're very tribal. And for instance, and you saw this in Vietnam, Vietnamese troops often behaved incredibly badly to local villagers because these weren't their villages. These weren't their area. They came from a different part of Vietnam, so they thought it was okay to treat them like shit. I've seen the same happen in Afghanistan, where you get Afghan troops and police who come from some completely different area. You plonk them down in Sangin or somewhere else, they don't give a damn what happens to the people down there and so on. They're so tribal. You have to understand these forces in a way that very few Americans in Vietnam did understand them.
That leads us on to the government. So to what degree was the regime of Nguyen Dinh Diem, with his anti-Buddhist policies, to what degree did that impact on the ability of South Vietnam to resist communism, do you think?
One of the problems in an awful lot of Western interventions is that you send in the army, your own army, whether it's the American army, whether it's the Australian army or the British army, and inevitably soldiers have only a limited understanding of the culture of the people in the country. And one of the things the Americans in Vietnam, the American generals, often completely, they just regarded Diem as the president, and that was that. And the fact that he was a Catholic was merely incidental. But Vietnam's an overwhelmingly Buddhist country. When Diem, first of all, starts promoting Catholics in all directions, he made the Pope make one of his own brothers a cardinal. And he's promoting this Catholic minority at the expense of the Buddhist majority. And even before you bring the communists into the equation, you're upsetting a hell of a lot of people. And he also surrounded himself with very corrupt people. Unless you've got, I think there was a rather brilliant Oxford professor who's done a very good study called Paul Collier, who's done a great study of third world countries and the problems of democracy. And he said, unless you've got an effective and uncorrupt civil service and an effective and uncorrupt judiciary and a free media, you ain't going to get very far with democracy. And of course, this was true in spades in Vietnam, that you simply have an enormously corrupt Vietnamese government, just as you frequently have very corrupt Iraqi and Afghan governments. And it is very unlikely that those people out there in the villages are going to have any respect for them or interest in them. And the Vietnamese in particular, one thing the Viet Cong, the local communists, as distinct from the North Vietnamese who came down later, the Viet Cong were very good at this. That the one thing every villager saw when the Viet Cong, he might not like the Viet Cong because they very often would bury alive people in the village, in front of the whole village, who upset them. But on the other hand, the Viet Cong were poor. They had nothing except the clothes they stood up in and an AK-47, whereas the representatives of the government turn up in enormous Mercedes. Well, inevitably, even the villagers who don't like the Viet Cong in principle, and they may not have any interest in Leninist Marxist theory or any of that stuff, but they see people who are pretty much like them. Whereas when anybody from the government from Saigon comes, and of course this is another element, that the government people would just turn up in the countryside, try and collect some taxes, and then disappear back to Saigon. Well, the Viet Cong were always there among them. And that's another vital thing. You've got to be, unless you've got representatives of the government that local people are going to identify with, you're not in a good place.
When the Marines landed at Da Nang on the 8th of March 1965, no one had informed the South Vietnamese that they were coming, let alone asked for permission. Walter Lippmann had written that it used to be a war of the South Vietnamese assisted by the Americans. It was now becoming an American war very inefficiently assisted by the South Vietnamese. What caused the change in policy with the American war effort?
They simply saw that they were losing if they left it to the South Vietnamese. And they had this incredibly arrogant view that if they sent in round eyes, it was pure racist superiority stuff. That they simply thought that you send in a division of Marines and then a few divisions of the U.S. Army, and all these stupid little laundrymen, these little slit-eyed Vietnamese, they're all just going to run away. And they had no understanding. This comes back to the intelligence failure of just how highly motivated these Vietnamese were, and also what incredibly good soldiers they were at a tactical level. It was quite extraordinary. But again, we've seen it again. I mean, even now, I've been party to some of the debates about our interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. And again, the same belief that Western troops, with all their kit and the helicopters and all the rest of it, they're going to see off these people. But so often, with almost all these interventions, of course there's a military dimension. At some point, I'm not a pacifist. At some point, you've got to fight some of these people if you want to prevail. But there are also hugely important social, economic, political challenges which you can't ask soldiers to solve. And again, I've argued in my book that one of the mistakes the Americans made in Vietnam was to put generals in charge. In that, sure, you've got to have generals there, but you need all sorts of different people who maybe speak Vietnamese, who understand the Vietnamese, who understand the issues, and who treat them with respect. Everything about human relations is about respect. Again and again, you just see, whether it's just grunts out there in the boonies or soldiers in Afghanistan or Iraq, the failure to treat local people with respect is disastrous if you want to prevail. One sees it, and you can't expect soldiers to solve all these issues, because in the end, the speciality of soldiers, if we reduce it to the simplest terms, is to kill people. Now, I have an enormous respect for soldiers. That's why I've written so many books about them. But nonetheless, one has to recognize that is their fundamental role. If you're going to do the other stuff, which is indispensable if you're going to make a success of an intervention anywhere, then you need other sorts of people who are going to have other sorts of skills.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think you'll agree that Sir Max has an incredible amount of experience and has done a huge amount of research, and that enables him to distill down very complex situations to the essence of what is going on. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Battle of Ap Bac, I believe it highlights many of the issues that the United States were facing as they tried to integrate their war effort with the ARVN, the Army of the Republic of South Vietnam. The salient point of this is that the Battle of Ap Bac was fought on the 2nd of January 1963. The issues that surfaced at Ap Bac would resurface on many battlefields across many contacts throughout the war. We'll continue our interview with Sir Max next week.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.